next Wednesday, when we'll be taking evidence from the Lord Advocate, the Children's Reporter, and also from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. So this morning, agenda item 1 is to take a decision on considering business and private in relation to our work programme. Our members consent that item 4 is held in private. It is fine, thank you. We then move to agenda item 2, which is the consideration of continued petitions. And the first of the continued petitions we are going to consider this morning is petition number 2105 to safeguard Scottish listed buildings at risk of unnecessary demolition. This petition was lodged by Lydia Franklin on behalf of Save Britain's Heritage, and the petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to set a minimum evidence requirement to prevent unnecessary use of emergency public safety powers to demolish listed buildings. We last considered this petition on the 4th of June, which was our last meeting, and at that point we heard evidence from Hazel Johnson, Director of the Built Environment Forum Scotland, Laura Shanks, Chair of the Local Authority Building Standards Scotland, and Professor Gordon Masterton, Chair of the Institute of Civil Engineers Panel for Historical Engineering Works. And we were also joined then, as we are this morning, by our colleague Paul Sweeney, former member of the committee, who has taken an ongoing interest in this petition. So good morning to you, Mr Sweeney. And before the committee consider the evidence and how we might proceed in the back of last week's session, I wonder if you'd like to offer the committee some thoughts. Oh, Mr Sweeney's dropped off. But we're very actively trying to get Mr Sweeney back, so we will give him that opportunity. I saw his name in front of me and assumed we had him. We did. We did. Do we have him again? We'll come back to Mr Sweeney, I think, and in the meantime consider petition number 2098, which to provide essential investment in the Gaelic language to secure its future. This has been lodged by... I'm now stuck. I'm stuck because it's all in Gaelic. But the petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to bring investment in the Gaelic language to sustainable levels by increasing Borden Gaelic's annual budget to at least £8.5 million and to increase funding in line with inflation each year. We last considered this petition on the 11th of September, where we agreed to write to the Scottish Government seeking an update on the Gaelic Officer Scheme. Now, the Scottish Government's response states that it provided funding to ensure the Gaelic Officer Scheme was able to continue until the end of the financial year 24-25, and the Scottish Government then provided Borden Gaelic with a further 510 to support the scheme in 25-26. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr Torrance.
Considering the evidence that we've had, I wonder if the committee would consider closing the petition under Rule 15.7 of standing orders on the basis that the Scottish Government provided Borden Gaelic a further 510,000 to support the Gaelic Officer Scheme in 2025 as part of a 5.7 million uplift for Gaelic.
Thank you, Mr Torrance. Do any members have any other comments or thoughts? Are we content to close the petition on that basis in view of the Scottish Government's position? We are. We'll now move to petition number 2061 to require solicitors to ensure capacity of vulnerable individuals by having a medical professional co-sign legal documents. And this continued petition has been lodged by Laura Johnson-Brand, and it calls on the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to help prevent coercion of vulnerable, frail and debilitated individuals by requiring solicitors to have a medical professional co-sign legal documents that confirm the capacity of the individual. Now, we last considered this petition on 30th of October 24, and at that point we agreed to write to the Office of the Public Guardian, the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and Faculties in Scotland, the Law Society of Scotland and the Scottish Legal Complaints Commission. And the Office of the Public Guardian makes it clear that it would not comment on matters of policy, but notes that the proposals included in the petition could impact on the provisions for powers of attorney, guardianships and intervention orders and access to funds authorisations under the Adults with Incapacity Scotland Act of 2000. These provisions include the submission of medical reports for consideration by the judiciary or the OPG. Now, the Scottish Legal Complaints Commission has indicated that it receives a small but steady number of complaints each year, which may raise some concern about the steps taken by a solicitor to assess capacity, though it was not able to identify cases alleging coercive behaviour. And none of the service complaints investigated by the SLCC have been upheld. Conduct complaints about solicitors are not handled by the SLCC, but are passed to the Law Society of Scotland. Now, the data from the Law Society of Scotland shows that the overall number of applications made to the Client Perfection Fund increased between 20 and 24, though the number of paid claims remained roughly the same, and the LSS did not attempt to identify capacity-related claims, but it may be able to provide further data on whether claimants were individual solicitor firms or other. The Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and Faculties in Scotland noted concerns raised by doctors in both primary and secondary care regarding inconsistencies when it comes to lawyers involving medical teams to support capacity assessment when working with clients who are also in-hospital patients. They also noted that as long as assessment of capacity is undertaken by qualified individuals, they do not need to be medically qualified, highlighting concerns from primary care doctors that a requirement for a medical assessment in all situations may prove burdensome, time-consuming and potentially more expensive. But on balance, though, the Academy indicated that it was broadly supportive of the petition at this time. Finally, we've also received a submission from the petitioner, who points out that the Adults in Incapacity Scotland Act 2000, which provides the current framework and was subject to a review in 24, with the consultation analysis published earlier this year, the petitioner highlights the majority of responses agreeing that needed to be relevant changes to how power of attorney documents are obtained and by whom, and also that further mandatory attorney training was needed. And in the analysis of the consultation, the Scottish Government stated that the responses would inform the development of the bill, amending the Adults with Incapacity legislation, while the proposed bill was part of the programme for government announced last September. It was no longer included in the updated legislative programme published last month, however. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder, in light of the evidence, if the committee would consider closing the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standard Orders on the basis that it is already best practice for solicitors to obtain medical opinion if there is doubt about a person's capacity. The Scottish Government do not believe that legislative changes being sought are necessary or appropriate, and in evidence received, the committee suggests that the actions being called for could become time-consuming, costly and burdensome.
Mr Torrance has made that proposal. I mean, I am slightly concerned that the bill was in the government's programme for government in September, but then disappeared completely in the updated legislative programme. Mr Ewing?
Well, I mean, having read these submissions from the Law Society, the SLCC, the Office of the Public Guardian and others, I mean, this is an area that's not without complexity, that's for sure. But I do think that the fact that it has been removed from the programme, apparently, does beg the question of why. And I would have thought that it would be useful, before moving to close the petition, which otherwise I would do, is to find out why, because that, I think, is a legitimate question which should be answered. If we ask it and get an answer now, Convener, that might save time in the next session of Parliament where the petitioners to bring it back. So I don't think we would be unduly extending the work in this session of Parliament, which is by nature limited given the fact that we've got less than a year to go. But I do think it's curious as to what the reasons were for the Scottish Government not proceeding with it. I mean, having said that, and as a practising solicitor of some 20 years, no longer, but it is up to each solicitor to assess the capacity of a client, and if one has concerns, then one has to raise them. There is a clear professional, ethical duty to do so. And looking at the evidence from that we've seen, there seems to be vanishingly few cases where the solicitors have been accused of coercion in any way. I think that's specifically stated But that said, perhaps I would say that as a solicitor, wouldn't I? That could be said of me. So I sympathise with Mr Torrance's approach. I would agree with it were it not for the fact that the Scottish Government appear to have supported this but no longer do so. So if we find the answer out to that, then it may well be that we close the petition after we've got a satisfactory answer, if Mr Torrance is happy with that.
I'm happy with that. Could be
yes, I mean, I think Mr Torrance is quite right in his recommendation, but I think that paragraph in our understanding of things does stand out slightly, and I think we would be advised to know. So we more or less accept that the petition has run its course insofar as we can act, but it is important to understand why the bill has just disappeared from the government's programme, and so we'd like to ask.
I think so, and it must be said, and it should be said in the record, that were there to be a new system where a medical opinion was required, in practical terms that would involve probably tens of thousands of certificates in situations where, quite frankly, they wouldn't be required, because the solicitor would then be under an obligation to take a precautionary approach, and it would incredibly clog up the process of drawing a will, for example, or a power of attorney, and that in turn could lead to someone ceasing to have capacity in the intervening period where the process of obtaining medical opinion is going through, or die without leaving a will, and therefore an unnecessary intestacy has arisen. So the system is not without its flaws, and the costs of that new process would, I suspect, be very substantial indeed for the client to obtain the cost of these certificates, because I can't see the state paying for it any time soon. But
okay, thank you, Mr Ewing. I think we'll hold the petition open and we will seek to gain that. We'll now return to petition number 2105. Good morning, Mr Sweeney. I think you may have dropped off. We've done the preamble. We gave you the big build-up. I then pointed to the world and said that we were about to receive the wisdom of Mr Sweeney to be met by a great big blank nothing. However, you are now back with us, so without further preamble, would you like to give some thoughts to the committee before we consider how we might proceed in the back of the evidence we heard last week?
Thank you, Convener. Apologies to colleagues for the technical difficulties initially there. Really, just to say that I thought the evidence session that the committee heard was extremely useful and elicited a number of important points in relation to current deficiency in policy, most notably the lack of requirement for local authorities, building standards, building control departments to engage the services of a conservation accredited structural engineer when assessing the need to demolish or the extent to which a listed building should be demolished. I think it was clear from evidence from the local authority representative that there wasn't the time pressure that might be assumed, that actually normally with initial cordoning, etc., there is a significant period of time available to do that properly and thoroughly before coming to a considered view about what can be salvaged and what can't be salvaged. And similarly, too often inappropriately qualified individuals are making these critical decisions which have a permanent effect on the nation's heritage. So I think the purpose of the petition has been proven, the need for the recommendations of the petitioner have been proven. I understand that Save Britain's Heritage have corresponded further with the committee and they shared that correspondence with me. I associate myself with their comments. They have offered to meet with the committee. I think that might be a useful exercise to further understand their specific concerns. Moreover, the COSLA sort of general representation is that local authorities in Scotland are simply unable to effectively use many of the statutory provisions in the 1997 Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act due to a lack of resource, a lack of expertise, and clearly further guidance and support is needed from central government to actually give effect to the duties on local authorities in this regard of preservation of heritage and giving best effect to enforcement action, as well as updating statutory guidance in relation to the 2003 Buildings Act in relation to emergency powers, use of section 29 and 30, orders, dangerous buildings notices, where in the case of listed buildings or even buildings in conservation areas, that a care accredited engineer should be engaged prior to final decisions being made regarding what fabric can be retained and what can't be retained. I think that would be a useful measure to go forward, perhaps further engagement with COSLA to establish the real extent of the view on local authorities would be useful. I know we had correspondence from Renfrewshire Council, and certainly I conveyed correspondence from Glasgow City Council. But I think this is a widely held view across local authorities. Perhaps a COSLA planning representative could be a useful stakeholder to engage with, because I think there is a clear need here. It's a clear need for a legislative review, and there's a clear need for the Planning Directorate to up guidance to further strengthen provisions in regards to protections for listed buildings. That's my view on the matter. I hope the committee agrees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Sweeney. Do members have any comments or thoughts for reflection as a result? I think we could certainly maybe frame representation to COSLA in relation to the issue, but are there any other suggestions that might be made? Mr Torrance?
I wonder, Convener, if the committee would consider writing to the Minister, highlighting evidence heard and seeking an update on the possible expansion of the listed buildings advice provided in the Building Standards Enforcement Handbook and Procedural Handbook.
So, together with the suggestion from Mr Sweeney that we engage with COSLA on the key issue that they raised, or that we felt raised from the local authority aspect, are members content to keep the petition open and to proceed on that basis? We are. So, thank you very much, Mr Sweeney. I'm going to, because I see at the end of the table our colleague Beatrice Wishart, who's joining us this morning, I will switch now to the petition with which she is concerned and interested, which is petition number 2107, to use more money recovered from the proceeds of crime to support community-based charities that train animals to assist in the detection of drugs. This petition has been lodged by Kevin Cragans on behalf of the Shetland Times, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to direct more public funding recovered through the Proceeds of Crime Act to support charities such as Dogs Against Drugs, which are vital to their communities and play an integral part in the seizure of drugs and criminal assets. And we are joined by our MSP colleague Beatrice Wishart, who has an interest in this petition. Good morning, Ms Wishart. And of course we have our man in crufts on the committee, Mr Golden. We last considered this petition on the 9th of October 2024, where we agreed to write to the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs. The committee sought further detail on the work undertaken to consider longer-term options for funding charities which play a vital role in the seizure of drugs and criminal assets. And in her response on the 11th of November, the Cabinet Secretary reiterated the Scottish Government's commitment to progress a fairer funding approach for the third sector and stated that her officials continue to work across government to identify potential long-term funding solutions for charities similar to Dogs Against Drugs. Now, however, the response highlighted challenges in delivering long-term funding in the current economic context, as any commitments would reduce flexibility in future budgets. And the Cabinet Secretary made reference to some work in progress aimed at improving the clarity and consistency of grant-making practices across government, including developing a consistent baseline for third sector funding. So, before committee just considers any options it might have in this instance, can I ask Beatrice Wishart if she'd like to offer us some thoughts?
If I may, thank you very much, Convener. Thank you for inviting me to the committee this morning. I think you all know the background to this community-led charity, which was started over 20 years ago, and its aims are to act as a deterrent and also on an educational purpose. I am also very grateful to the engagement with the Justice Secretary, and the charity was grateful to receive £30,000 last year, which helped them over a financial difficulty for that year. But year on year they are struggling with funds to try and offer the service, which Police Scotland have said is very valuable. The Shetland Times petition was quite narrow in suggesting that cashback for communities should be extended more to the communities who have these kind of charities. But I think that Dogs Against Drugs is actually a very unique charity in what it does, and it provides public service that is valued obviously by Police Scotland, but also by the community. So I would suggest that it is perhaps time, given its history and given that we would not want to see the loss of dogs in the community, that it is long past time that the government finds a more suitable funding model to ensure that the very valuable work that they do continues. If I can give an example of how much drugs were seized in 2024, the value of drugs seized in 2024 for 12 months was £554,000, and that's in our community that has 23,000 people.
Well, it's quite a significant sum of money that was raised. Any thoughts? Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome the Shetland Times campaign. And actually, the member has highlighted the value of those seizures, and actually one way to combat that is through Dogs Against Drugs and the specialist training, whether it be, I don't know what breeds are there, whether it's beagles, short-haired pointers, German shepherds, but they're all fantastic dogs that can help to tackle the scourge of the drug problems. And it seems to me that I think the committee should follow up with the Scottish Government to ask for clarity on the specific work it has done to improve grant-making practices, including in terms of progressing the development of a consistent baseline for third sector funding and what this means in terms of practical actions the government is taking. I think it might be overstretched to entirely ring-fence those funds, but I think perhaps priority should be made for third sector organisations such as Dogs Against Drugs.
Thank you. So you have your pause all over the petition. I think I quite like the phrase long past time that Ms Wishart used, because I think 20 years and no sensible funding model, long past time is a perfectly reasonable description for the fact that we've not resolved this. And I agree, you can't hypothecate the funding, but I can't imagine that a funding model would be costing us more than 554,000. So clearly there are proceeds being raised, and therefore it ought to be possible, I would have thought. Ms Wishart, is there anything further you'd like to say to the committee?
May I say that, the latest figures I have is that it costs around 130,000 to operate Dogs Against Drugs each year. They're not asking for 130,000, but some kind of sustainable model going forward. They do raise funds through their corporate work. And they're having bingo evenings and raffles and things, and I'm not sure that's a sensible way to continue, which, I mean, well supported by the community though it is, it's not a sensible way to support the police in terms of deterrent and prevention of drugs coming into the island.
I wouldn't like to think the nation's security relied upon a bingo drive, but I think we could make some of those representations, incorporate them into the Scottish Government, because I mean this is obviously a very successful charity that is doing great and good work, and it is looking for a model, as I said, long past time, having sought and been assured that something might be done, and I think we'd like to see something actually be done. So thank you very much, and we'll keep the petition open on that basis. We'll move to petition PE 1900 to access to prescribed medication for detainees in police custody, which is where we were originally scheduled to begin our proceedings this morning. Lodged by Kevin John Lawson, it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to ensure that all detainees in police custody can access their prescribed medication, including methadone, in line with existing relevant operational procedures and guidance. And we'll ask considered this on the 11th of December 24, where we agreed to write to the then Minister for Drugs and Policy, and Alcohol Policy, our late colleague Christina McKelvey. Members will recall that as a result of the committee's work, the Scottish Government conducted a rapid review of each health board to check the current arrangements for ensuring access to medication for detainees. The Minister for Public Health and Women's Health responded to the committee to confirm that the majority of health boards have taken the appropriate action to meet the required standards, and the submission states that by spring 25, the aim is for all health boards to have the appropriate care and practices in place for detainees in police custody. Now, at that point, the Scottish Government will then begin developing an approach to ongoing monitoring in the form of annual updates. The Minister's response states that NHS Grampian has recognised that more is required to ensure compliance with the appropriate policies and procedures when dealing with detainees in police custody. And the Minister notes that in Elgin and across the NHS Grampian area, there are still some concerns relating to detainees not receiving their prescribed methadone while in police custody. The written submission from the Minister includes a copy of correspondence from NHS Grampian. The letter states that NHS Grampian is at the stage of planning the introduction of opioid replacement therapy, prescribing and administration across all three of its custody suites. And the correspondence also states that NHS Grampian now has a robust standard operating procedure in place and has planned comprehensive training programme for its nursing staff. And the petitioner's written submission shares that he read the Minister's response, with a mixture of sadness, anger and regret. He points out that this denial of adequate healthcare had not been noticed despite the existence of controlled drug accountable officers across Scotland for 10 years. And so do members, in the light of the petitioner's angst and the noted representations received, any suggestions as to how we might proceed? Mr Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if the committee would consider writing to the Minister for Drugs and Alcohol Policy seeking confirmation that all health boards have an appropriate care and practice in place for detainees in police custody, and an update on the work on monitoring compliance with the rapid review, and a detailed update on NHS Grampian's policy and practice for providing prescribed medication, including the status of its controlled drug licence application.
Thank you. Mr Torrance has made appropriate suggestions. Are there any? Mr Ewing.
Yes, I very much support that, and I wonder if we could include in the letter the reference that Dr Coldwell makes to the apparent lack of action in this regard, and his negative comments and the petitioner's observation that that each health board has a controllable drug accountable officer, a CDAO. He says, strangely, CDAO don't seem to be accountable for their failure to follow their policy. I thought that was an interesting remark, and I wonder if the Minister could be asked to comment on it, because it does seem this has dragged on for a long time. So I pointed out when the petition was last called, I think it had taken 3 years for nothing very much to happen.
Yes. Colleagues, content? We will keep the petition open and proceed on that basis. Petition number 1993 to reform the financial support for social work students on work placements, lodged by David Grimm and Lucy Challoner, calling on the Scottish Parliament urge the Scottish Government to ensure social work students have access to adequate funding, financial support during their studies, by two reasons. Firstly, providing bursaries to all third and fourth year undergraduate social work students on placements, and secondly, reforming the assessment criteria and adequately funding the bursaries for postgraduate social work students on work placements. Last considered again on the 30th of October 24, and then we wrote to the Minister for Higher and Further Education about the Social Work Education Partnerships report on practice learning funding. And the Minister for Higher and Further Education's response states that the report recommended improvements to the system of disbursing financial support and to the oversight and quality assurance of practice learning. And the research for the report also expanded to consider the wider support packages for under and postgraduate social work students. And the Minister's response outlines recent changes to the support made available for social work students. From the academic year 24-25, the Scottish Government is providing all eligible under and postgraduate social work students in an assessment placement with a £750 grant, and the grant is intended to provide support for costs incurred while undertaking mandatory placements. And the submission also highlights that up to £2,000 can be claimed by those with exceptional travel costs related to placements in or students being resident in remote and rural locations. So for postgraduate students, the earnings threshold for bursary eligibility has been increased and the various discretionary allowances have been streamlined. The petitioner's recent written submission welcomes these steps taken by the Scottish Government. However, the petitioner remains concerned that the changes do not resolve the fundamental inequality between social work and other studies such as nursing, midwifery and paramedicine. Do we have any suggestions? Mr Ewing.
I wonder, in the light of what you've just said, Convener, that we might close this petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that a grant of £750 is now available to all eligible under and postgraduate social work students to support them with costs incurred while in placements. That, secondly, the additional funding, as you've pointed out, of up to £2,000 can be claimed by students for exceptional travel costs related to placements in or students being resident in remote and rural locations. Also, that the earnings threshold for postgraduate bursary eligibility has been increased. And finally, that postgraduate discretionary allowances have been streamlined. In making this motion to close a convener, perhaps if members were agreed, then we could point out to the petitioner that if, in the light of experience of these new changes, the petitioner considers that the financial position is still inadequate then it would be open to him to challenge this new regime as being inadequate. For example, if there were cases that someone in a remote location wasn't given access to the additional travel cost, that would be a legitimate area. That's just one example. So, I'm sympathetic to the other points the petitioner makes, but I think the government response has been fairly substantial, given the overall scarce resources.
I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Golden.
Yeah, I fully agree with Mr. Ewing. I think it's out with the scope of the petition, but I think the nub of the issue is around recruitment and where a petition to be submitted in the next session with that slightly wider scope. It might allow the new committee to look at other aspects that councils are doing to aid recruitment, particularly in our councils out with the Central Belt. I'm certainly aware of some initiatives in Angus Council, and actually this specific petition is just one part of that wider recruitment issue.
Yeah, I think we could reasonably point that out in response in the closing letter to the petitioner, because I think there has been substantial movement, as colleagues have suggested. We have proposals to close the petition on that basis. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, obviously, and by the time the next session convenes, it may be that we'll see, and it might be that there's scope for something further if the petitioner seeks to do so. So are we content to proceed on that basis? Thank you. We move to the last of our continuing petitions this morning, which is petition number 2039, fair pay to student nurses while on placement, and it's lodged by Amy Lee. It calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to pay student nurses for their placement hours. We last considered this on the 30th of October, and at that time we agreed to write to the Scottish Government to ask what consideration has been given to the Royal College of Nursing's report on nursing student finance. The Scottish Government's response states that the former Chief Nursing Officer met with students at a roundtable event to discuss the themes in the report's recommendations, and a short life working group was then set up to review the clinical placement expense guidance to respond to student concerns in the Royal College's recommendations. The submission highlights that the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care is committed to carrying out a review of the financial support package for nursing, midwifery and paramedicine students, and the views of stakeholders, including students, are being considered as part of that programme and review. Do colleagues have any suggestions or ideas as to how we might proceed? Mr. Goldham?
Thank you, Convener. I think, unfortunately, we'll need to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that, firstly, the Royal College of Nursing is not in favour of student nurses being paid while on clinical placement, and secondly, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care is carrying out a review of the financial support package for nursing, midwifery and paramedicine students. However, in closing this petition, I think we should highlight to the petitioner that were that review not to take place, were that review not to meet with the petitioner's particular asks, then the petition could be brought back in the next session of Parliament.
Okay. Are colleagues content to proceed on that basis? We are. Thank you very much. We thank the petitioner, and we will obviously write explaining our reasonings as well. That brings us to agenda item 3, which is a consideration of new petitions. And before I introduce our new petitions, as I always do, just highlight to those following today's proceedings, because they may be looking in to see how the committee is going to consider their petition, that before we do so, we do two things. We firstly ask the Parliament's independent research body, SPICE, to give us an impartial view of the issues raised by the petition, and we also write to the Scottish Government for its initial view as well. And we do both those things because historically they were the first two things we would otherwise have decided to do, and it just expedites the process and consideration of the petition. I see we're being joined by our colleague Eleanor Whittam this morning, so I'm going to take the petitions out of order in order to make as much efficient use of Ms Whittam's day as is possible. So we will begin with the last of the new petitions rather than the first, which is petition number 2156, to improve access to ADHD diagnosis and treatment across Scotland. This has been lodged by Terence Lloyd, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to urgently address undiagnosed and untreated ADHD by developing a funded national ADHD strategy, standardising ADHD diagnostic pathways, reducing waiting times, and ensuring equitable access to ADHD diagnosis, treatment and support across Scotland. And as I said a moment ago, we're joined by Eleanor Whitton, who I'll invite to say a few words in a moment. The petition states that Scotland faces a growing ADHD crisis, with long waiting times for diagnosis and treatment, or no access at all due to regional funding disparities. The SPICE briefing notes that some health boards have recently withdrawn their neurodevelopmental assessment services, and the briefing also notes that in many regions the only way of obtaining an ADHD diagnosis and medication is now through a private assessment. The Scottish Government's response to the petition states that work is underway to implement adult neurodevelopmental pathways, to standardise diagnostic pathways and increase access to support. The response highlights the public consultation on the proposed Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill, which included discussion on statutory strategies, including national ones. However, the Scottish Government states that it does not currently have any plans to develop and implement a specific national ADHD strategy. The Scottish Government highlight the funding made available to health boards for improvement to mental health services and its engagement with the Royal College of GPs on voluntary and shared care agreements. So, before the committee considers how it might proceed, I wonder if Eleanor Whitton would like to offer her thoughts.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm very grateful to be able to speak today in support of Petition 2156, brought forward by my constituent Terence Lloyd, which seeks improved and equitable access to ADHD diagnosis and treatment in Scotland. Failure to diagnose and support ADHD early in life is not a neutral act, it causes lasting harm. When children and young people with ADHD are not recognised and supported, they are often labelled as disruptive, difficult, defiant, or as a clumsy daydreamer. Without understanding, they internalise shame and difference. As they grow into adulthood, the consequences of that early neglect are compounded. We see individuals undiagnosed, unsupported, fall through the cracks into systems that were never built to care for them, into substance use as a way of self-regulating, into the criminal justice system due to impulsivity or misunderstood behaviour, into cycles of poverty, debt, unstable housing, and often homelessness. I've worked directly with people who have lived this reality. I know what it means to come to a diagnosis in your 30s, your 40s, or even your 50s after years of feeling broken, when in fact the system has failed you. I personally know what it's like to be 50 and come to the realisation that I have lived my whole life with a neurodevelopmental difference, most likely ADHD, and I can look back on so much and understand it so much better. This is a public health issue. This is a mental health issue. But above all, it's a social justice issue. ADHD is recognised as a neurodevelopmental condition that affects people from all walks of life, yet access to assessment and support remains deeply unequal. I've heard from far too many individuals who are left struggling for years without recognition, without treatment, and without understanding. In my area, there is no adult pathway to an ADHD diagnosis without a co-occurring severe and enduring mental health issue. And it is wholly unacceptable that people must become acutely unwell to have their ADHD recognised and treated. So we must ask ourselves what kind of system allows someone to wait years for a diagnosis whilst their education, their career, their mental health and relationships suffer. This is not a system built on fairness. It is not a system that reflects our shared commitment to health equity. Mr Lloyd's petition brings into sharp focus the urgent need for reform, the postcode lottery in diagnostic services, the lack of specialised training for clinicians, and the gaps in support post-diagnosis are all issues we can and must address. By supporting the asks of this petition, we could affirm a fundamental truth, that every person in Scotland deserves access to timeous, compassionate and appropriate care, regardless of where they live and what their circumstances are. There is a lot of work happening across the country as we sit here today, as the government did outline, but change is not being felt on the ground, and in most places, and we must collectively put our shoulders to the wheel on this issue. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And yes, I mean, I think it is a bit disturbing to read the lack of parity of access and the current position as it stands. Do colleagues have any suggestions as to how we might proceed? Mr Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. In light of the length of time that the committee has got left, I wonder if the committee would consider passing over to health, social care and sport, because in their work programme they are doing some around ADHD.
Yes, I understand the Health Committee has agreed to undertake a review of the issues raised, but in parallel to this petition. So I think in this instance, it might be the best thing that we can do, given the time of the Parliament. Mr Ewing?
Yes, I think provided the Health Committee are going to do this, then I think we should pass it to them, because they are better able, I think, to do that. I just wanted to add, though, that in backing up what Ms Whittam has said today, this is an issue that arises almost every day in our constituency, concerns, and is of huge concern to many young people and their families, in particular their parents, in waiting forever for nothing to happen. It's a huge source of tension and problems and difficulty socially for those families and those children involved. So I think it's a very worthy petition that needs to be thoroughly examined and pursued, and the apparent lack of any inclination of the Scottish Government to do anything about it is quite baffling and inadequate.
I wonder then, we're content to, should we, I'm just wondering, do we want to establish first whether the Health Committee would be prepared to take on the petition, or?
I think they have agreed.
They have agreed, right. Well, they've agreed to the inquiry. So on that basis, I think we can proceed on that basis. Are we content? We are. Thank you very much. That brings us to petition number 2138, to make publicly owned buildings accessible for people with colour blindness. Colleagues will be aware that they have fresh submissions before them that have been received, lodged by Ian Hume McKee, who some of you might actually remember. Well, no, only Fergus Ewing and I might remember, was a former, and David Torrance as well, actually, was a former parliamentary colleague of ours. He stood down in 2011, I understand. I do remember him, Dr. Ian McKee. I can remember some very florid chamber contributions and sparring engagements in times past. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to make the design and signage for publicly owned buildings accessible for people with colour blindness. So good morning, Mr McKee, if you're joining us. The petitioner highlights the difficulty he and other colour-blind people experience when dealing with a world in which information is often provided in colour-coded way. He points out that hospitals use red and green lines to direct patients, and graphs and government documents use colour to differentiate trends. The Spice briefing states that there are regulations and guidance on inclusive access to public buildings. There is limited guidance, specifically, on addressing the challenges associated with colour blindness. The briefing outlines the requirements to make reasonable adjustments for disabled people as set out in the Equality Act. However, Spice note that it is not clear whether colour blindness would constitute a disability under the Act, as it would likely depend on the impact the condition has on an individual. We have received a written submission from our parliamentary colleague Gordon MacDonald, which highlights the challenges faced by colour-blind high school students. He shares an example of a student in his constituency who was unable to answer a higher grade A geography exam question because it could only be answered by identifying colours on a map. And he explains that the question was worth 20 out of 100 marks, leaving the student at serious disadvantage. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this agenda that we sought an initial view from the Scottish Government on each new petition. However, I was disappointed that the response from the Scottish Government, which was due in mid-February, was only most recently received. But, however, we do now have that before us, and I wonder if the committee would like to consider how best to proceed. But may I just say in so doing that if we receive, if responses to our inquiries aren't timeously responded to, it merely delays our ability to represent the petitioner who has brought the petition before Parliament, which is our responsibility and our endeavour. And I would ask, make the point that we understand it can take a little bit of time to consider the thoughts in relation to petition, but it's very unhelpful if we then don't have the response in due course such that we can consider the detail of the petition. Tim Aisley, did I see you, Mr Torrance, or was Mr Golden? I didn't sure which of the two of you was trying to catch my eye there. It was Mr Golden, I gather.
Yes, I think there's, with the delay to the response, in addition to the generality of the response, I think it would be worthwhile writing back to the Minister, seeking detailed views on the action called for in the petition, details of the current accessibility standards for the design and signage in publicly owned buildings for people with colour blindness, and the Minister's view on whether it is acceptable for the Scottish Government to fail to provide a response to the Citizen Participation and Public Petitions Committee, as the convener has highlighted, and perhaps as well to write to the Disability Equality Scotland, seeking its views on the action called for in the petition.
Yes. I mean, I was actually quite, I mean, that must have been quite tricky for any higher grade geography student, suddenly discovering that part of the exam was conditional on you being able to identify colours, because you would be quite concerned. So the suggestion that it might not actually be a disability of any sort is therefore something that is also a cause for concern. Are colleagues content with the suggestions as made by Mr Golden? We are. That brings us to petition number 2150 to amend the Scottish Housing Regulator's mandate or to create a body to protect owners of ex-council properties. This petition has been lodged by Wilson Chowdhury. The petition is calling, I should have a link, that might Mr Chowdhury in the gallery. The petition is calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to expand the mandate of the Scottish Housing Regulator, that's the SHR, or to establish a dedicated body to ensure owners of ex-council properties receive the support and protection they need to deal with significant structural issues. The new or amended regulator should, according to the petition, provide oversight and advocacy for owners of ex-council properties experiencing structural crises, to monitor standards and safety through ongoing inspections and the implementation of mitigation measures to maintain safety standards in homes, particularly when systemic issues affect multiple properties, to coordinate, support and facilitate clearer pathways for owners of ex-council houses to access advice, financial aid or alternative accommodation where properties become uninhabitable due to structural risks and where local authorities may have a conflict of interest, and to ensure transparency by requiring relevant authorities to disclose known structural risks and safety failures and to provide clear information on the presence of hazards like RAC to owners of ex-council homes. Now, we've received 2 additional submissions to petitioners in which he provides a comprehensive view of the main issues around reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, RAC, and similar structural defects affecting council-built properties before privatisation. Indeed, members may recall that the petitioner does have another active position under consideration by this committee, which is in fact calling for the provision of support to RAC-affected communities. And our colleagues in the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee have been undertaking ongoing scrutiny of building safety and maintenance issues in Scotland, including consideration of RAC, and in providing evidence to the LGHPC, the former Minister for Housing stated his continuing engagement with local authorities regarding support for RAC-affected communities. I should say there's also a members' business debate taking place today in Parliament on recognising RAC in council and former council housing. Our SPICE briefing for the petition in front of us today tells us that the Scottish Housing Regulator, that's the SHR, statutory objective under the Housing Scotland Act 2010 is to safeguard and promote the interests of persons who are or may become either homeless, tenants of social landlords or recipients of housing services provided by social landlords. And the briefing further highlights that the SHR does not have any specific advocacy role nor a statutory role regarding owners of ex-council properties, as I think most colleagues will have established when representing constituents. The Scottish Government's response makes it clear that it has no plans to amend the SHR's objective, which is the regulation of social landlords. The response also reiterates the Government's position that local authorities have a duty to ensure housing in their areas meets the relevant standards, but where ex-council homes were sold under the right to buy, there are no responsibilities further incumbent upon local authorities in terms of the maintenance of those properties, which fall to the owner. Finally, the Scottish Government states that homeowners who require advice and information can access the scheme of assistance, under which local authorities can provide financial and non-financial help for private housing. Right, so a fairly brusque and clear determination from the Scottish Government this time. which I think limits our options. But do colleagues have any suggestions as to how we proceed? I mean, I should say that the RAC issues remain part of an open, ongoing petition. And I recognise there's been some further suggestions in respect of them in this petition, but they relate, at least that helps in relation to the continuing discussion of the ongoing petition in relation to RAC. But in respect of the register, the Scottish Government seem to be being fairly determined. But I wonder what colleagues feel in the light of that, really. Mr. Torrance?
In light of the Scottish Government's decision not to change housing regulators' remit, and they're pretty determined in that, and also because there is an ongoing petition in the petitioner's name on RAC, I wonder if the committee would consider closing the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standard Orders on the basis that the Scottish Government has no plans to extend the Scottish housing regulators' remit of independent regulator of all social landlords, which is set in law, and homeowners affected by serious structural issues can access support through the scheme of assistance provided by local authorities, which can include financial help.
Thank you. Mr. Ewing?
Yes, I would support that, but in doing so, I would just point to the fact that the petitioner having another petition live before this Parliament is not today in any way, I think, losing anything. There is no door being shut on the petitioner. The petitioner is already in the room with the other petition, which is directly considering the RAC issues. And moreover, as you've indicated, Convener, as well as the members' debate, there is virtually constant members accountability raising questions about RAC every week. The government response has been inadequate by any stretch of the imagination, and that has been covered in the Chamber time and time again. And I would just observe, so I just wanted to stress that if the petitioner feels today is a disappointment, I think there is no need so to do, because it's very much a live issue before Parliament. I think whatever view one takes about the performance of the government, that is undoubtedly true. The other point I just wanted to make very briefly is that if there were to be another quango, another regulator, it would make not a blind bit of difference to the problems that face us at the moment, because by definition, any such new quango could not impact things that had happened before the existence and the establishment of said body. You can't apply judgment retrospectively in that regard, nor do I think that a new public body would really make the kind of difference that most people want to see. I simply don't think it's the right solution to an admitted very serious problem indeed. But that's just a personal view, and that could be right or wrong. And that's not the main point. The main point, I think, is the petitioner has done extremely well in raising this in Parliament, and successfully so, with members of all parties pursuing this vigorously and continuing to do so between now and next May.
But I think that the issue raised, although the government has said it has no plans to address it in the way that's suggested, we agree is necessarily one that we've all had experience of, which is those people who have found themselves in this situation. So I still think the issue is an important one, but it will have to be addressed differently. So I suspect, given the position we're in, we have no further course of action open to us. Mr. Chowdhury.
I agree with colleagues, but do you think, is there a way where we can merge both petitions together? So that there isn't
no, the problem is we're not allowed, the standing orders of the Parliament don't allow us to have two petitions open in relation to the same thing at the same time, so we can't do that, I'm afraid. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that some of the issues here remain active in a live petition. I think in closing it, we accept that there is an issue here, but the Scottish Government, and at this stage of the life of the Parliament, there's not much more we can give effect to in that regard, have said they're not prepared to pursue the suggested solution that is before us. So I don't think we've got any other course of action than the one Mr. Torrance has suggested to us. Are we agreed? Yep. We are. So I know that might be a disappointment in some senses, but that's sometimes the way these things fall, I'm afraid. That brings us to petition number 2152 to review and update the home report system to ensure it protects both the seller and the buyer. This is the petition lodged by Leslie Roberts. the petition is calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to review and update the home report system, to require home reports to be updated every 3 months while a property remains for sale, to ensure surveyors are held accountable where they are found to have assessed a property inaccurately. In an additional submission, the petitioner highlights her personal experience of purchasing a house with defects, which were picked up in a secondary builder's report, but which she believes should have been picked up in the home report. The Spice briefing notes that this petition is very similar to petition PE 1957, home reports make surveyors more accountable. We agreed to close that petition on the 21st of February last year on the basis that, one, the scope of the home report is outlined at the beginning of the report, and two, the members of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors are subject to various requirements when drawing up home reports. The briefing reiterates that the single survey, which is part of the home report and which is provided by the seller of most homes, is not the same as a structural survey, and while the single survey fundamentally relies on a visual inspection of a property, the structural survey provides more detailed information on its structure and fabric, and it also adds that the single survey has to be drawn up by a surveyor registered with or authorised to practice by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and that there are various legal responsibilities and professional standards that these surveyors, with which these surveyors have to comply. The initial Scottish Government response echoes these points and also adds that a review of the home report is currently underway. The review aims to update the home report guidance to ensure the limitations are clear to buyers, along with providing information about other steps they can take to assess the condition of the home they are considering buying. Do members have any comments or suggestions for action in relation to the home report, the limitations of which have to be made clear to buyers? Mr Ewing.
Well, I have tried to consider the papers carefully here, Convener. I've come to the conclusion that that we should seek to close this petition under Rule 15.7 of the Standing Orders, primarily on the basis that the surveyors are already subject to various requirements, including the need to have a complaint handling procedure in place and to offer independent third-party recourse for complaints, but also that the home report guidance is currently being updated to make the limitations of the single survey clearer to buyers and to provide information about other steps that buyers can take to assess the condition of the home they're considering buying. And in saying that, I mean, I think it's important to state something that is true but is perhaps not mentioned very much, which is when someone buys a heritable property, typically a house or a flat, a dwelling house, the system is caveat emptor. The buyer takes on the risks, and it is up to the buyer to decide whether or not the home report is sufficient. And very often in practice, and this happened in my day, one would look at the home report and decide that there were further investigations that were required to be carried out, for example, into whether alterations had been made with or without consent internally to a property, or whether there was an extensive problem of infestation of dry or other forms of rot. And all these things have to be discussed by the buyer's solicitor with the buyer, and the buyer's solicitor owes legal duties. The RICS rules about what surveyors are bound to do are very clear. It must be a chartered surveyor. That chartered surveyor must have professional indemnity. The chartered surveyor, in providing the home report, does not have a duty to provide a thorough, detailed, intrusive, incursive report, but only a report designed primarily for mortgage valuation. Yeah. Having seen these reports myself and worked with them, and having seen the home report recently, I would say it's a very limited document. And frankly, it spends more time setting out the exclusions of liability than it does describing the actual property. That may be a bit cynical, but that was true of the home report I saw very, very recently. And I just think that it's a much wider issue here. Possibly the petitioner's complaint is an individual legal complaint that she may have to pursue against the RICS or the individual surveyors, indemnified insurers. And that would be a legal private case for her to pursue. And in saying that, I'm not passing any judgment. It's a possibility. But given that the Scottish Government is carrying out a review in this area, there aren't any magic solutions here. The home report was brought in to replace a situation where there was 5 parties all going for the same property and 5 different surveyors. surveying the same property in each type. It was regarded that that was an unnecessary expense, an unnecessary procedure, and that's the reason why the home reports were brought in. But there's no perfect system, and caveat emptor is where it starts and, frankly, where it very often finishes, and it's up to the individual to listen carefully to advice from solicitors. And I didn't mean to give a conveyancing lecture here, Convener, but because we're proposing to close a new petition, I thought it only courteous and respectful to the petitioner to set out the reasons why I don't think this committee at this stage in Parliament can do anything more, whilst recognising that the petitioner certainly has raised valid points, which I'm quite sure will be reflected by many other people who were less than satisfied with the experience that they had. But that's by no means new, Convener, and if there were easy answers that everybody could be happy, I'm sure they would have been discovered long ago.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. I hear echoing in my ear my late colleague David McLetchie, who similarly was a conveyancing lawyer of some experience, and his views on the legislation on home reports as introduced in the 2007 Parliament. They still, I can remember those debates vividly, and I do think there is an interesting potential future petition to be had to this Parliament, following up on the Scottish Government identifying the limitations of the home report. If they are under review, I think it would be very interesting to know how those limitations have been addressed and what the future value of the home report is, because it does seem to me only to mitigate expense in a very few cases. Other people now find that they have to incur the very same expense over and above the fact that a home report has been commissioned. However, we have agreed to close the petition at this stage, I think, have we? Yep, yes. We have. It's petition number 2154 to ensure planning consideration for equestrian accessibility, lodged by Jasmine Bissett. The petition is calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to review and update planning policies to make it mandatory for new urban developments to give consideration to equestrian usage and ensure suitable access and signage is included as part of this consideration. The SPICE briefing for the petition explains that in general, decisions on planning applications must be made in accordance with the development plan, and that the development plan for the given area in Scotland consists of the 4th National Planning Framework, the NPF4, and the relevant local development plan, the LDP, with which all colleagues will be familiar. NPF4 requires planning authorities to consider the need to safeguard access rights when developing LDPs. But under the Reform Scotland Act 2003, local authorities and national park authorities have a legal duty to protect routes for responsible public access to land in the countryside, and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code stipulates that access rights extend to horse riding. And in its response to petition, the Scottish Government states that it expects the issue of horse-related infrastructure in urban developments, there's a sentence, to be considered at a local level, including in terms of signage to ensure suitability to location and use. In an additional submission, the petitioner expresses the view that local authorities tend to prioritise more popular modes of transport to the detriment of the needs of equestrians. Additionally, the petitioner highlights that the response she received from the Scottish Government acknowledged that Scotland's great trails, he said tails, Scotland's great trails were designed solely for pedestrian usage, and that catch-up has been needed to open suitable areas of the trails for other uses. And I have equestrian users in my own constituency, so I am aware of sometimes the lack of access or thought given to equestrian users in their routes, but notwithstanding which, do colleagues, in the light of the Scottish Government's response, have any suggestions as to how we might proceed? Mr Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. In light of evidence from the Scottish Government, I wonder if the committee would consider closing a petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that, where access rights apply, local authorities and national park authorities already have a statutory duty to uphold these and to enable all types of responsible access, including equestrian. The Scottish Government expects the need for equestrian-specific infrastructure, including signage for shared use, to be considered locally in order to ensure that provision is appropriate to location and use.
Colleagues? I think we're agreed. I mean, I actually think there are some issues underlying this petition, but I'm afraid time is short in this Parliament, and I don't know that we can do justice to them. So it is a petition that I think somebody might like to consider bringing back, because I think it would be a case of challenging the government's assertion in relation to some of these matters. But at this stage, I think the committee is minded to close. So we thank the petitioner. Petition number 2155 to improve support for people trying to give up e-cigarettes and vaping, lodged by Daniel Taggart, calling on the Scottish Government, the Parliament rather, to urge the Scottish Government to support the support available to people trying to give up e-cigarettes and vapes by expanding access to nicotine replacement therapy and to stop smoking medications to include e-cigarette uses in vapors. The Spice briefing for this petition explains that while e-cigarettes and vapes are considered lower risk than traditional tobacco products, they still pose health concerns, and further research is required to understand their long-term impact on health. The most recent data for Scotland shows that 12% of adults reported using vapes or e-cigarettes in 23, compared to just 10% the year earlier. The NHS guidance on public health service for pharmacists states that e-cigarette users should be able to access licensed smoking cessation products, including nicotine replacement therapy, NRT. But however, the guidance cautions that many e-cigarette products contain nicotine, which means that switching to NRT could create issues with determining the correct dosage. Additionally, for patients who try to quit non-nicotine e-cigarette products, reintroducing nicotine through NRT would be inappropriate, and for those patients, the guidance recommends referral to non-pharmacy specialist smoking cessation services, which may include telephone support, one-to-one support or group support. Now, in its initial response to the petition, the Scottish Government mentions the Tobacco and Vaping Framework Roadmap 2034, under which it has committed to improve information around vapes and to increase awareness of avenues for support to stop vaping or smoking. And the Government is also committed to continue to fund and support cessation services. But despite this, the Quit Your Way Scotland service, also referenced in the Scottish Government's response, appears to be geared primarily towards those who are trying to quit smoking. In fact, with caveats around evolving research on their safety, vapes are being suggested as one of the few possible options to help people who do wish to give up smoking. Do members have any suggestions for action? Mr. Golden.
I think there's something in this petition. The reality is that in the UK, the battle to stop people smoking has largely been won with the long-term trends that smoking will eventually be a peripheral usage for the most of the population. However, e-cigarettes and vapes, initially designed as a replacement product, have actually seen a massive expansion, particularly in young people, particularly in under 18s, despite it being illegal to do so. So I think it would be worth writing to the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health and ask for clarity on what steps the Scottish Government is taking to increase support, as well as awareness of support, for those trying to quit e-cigarettes and vapes, with a particular focus on young people.
Content. We are, and that draws to conclusion the public part of our meeting today. As I said at the start of our meeting, we do in fact have an additional meeting of the committee taking place next Wednesday the 25th of June, when we'll be taking evidence from, among others, the Lord Advocate and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. But for the moment, we move into private session to consider agenda item number 4.